President Trump says peace in Ukraine is getting closer all the time, but how much progress is really being made as Russia rejects a proposed Christmas truce? Meantime, are America's European friends and allies waking up from the end of history as NATO's Secretary General warns about the kind of war that our grandparents or great-grandparents endured?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the editorial page, Jillian Melcher and Joe Sternberg, both based in Europe. Asked about prospects for peace in Ukraine with Russia on Monday in the Oval Office, President Trump said, "I think we're closer now than we have been ever, and we'll see what we can do." He went on to say the problem is they'll want to get it ended, and all of a sudden they won't. And Ukraine will want to get it ended, and all of a sudden they won't. So we have to get them on the same page, unquote. Jillian, what's the latest? I have lost track at this point what the deadline now. At some point, there was some suggestions that Christmas was the deadline for President Trump's offer. How are these negotiations proceeding?
Yes, I think the key thing to understand here is that Ukraine has been trying to present to the U.S. that it's willing to negotiate. And I mean, you did see polls coming out with a lot of Ukrainians who are willing to stop the war under current lines. But the problem is, if you look at the statements by Kremlin officials, Russia's negotiating position has not budged. So the U.S. tactic has been to put pressure on Ukraine to give more and more concessions. Ukraine doesn't want to be seen as the obstacle to peace. But ultimately, anything's going to have to go through Moscow. And I just think that this conversation about being close to a peace, it's a bit unrealistic when you have one party to the negotiations who's not willing to compromise, who's willing to fight it out until they get what they want. So consider me skeptical.
It does seem, Joe, as if there are some big questions still unsettled. I'm reading some headlines that President Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine has ruled out formally recognizing segments of territory that Vladimir Putin is de facto in control of in eastern Ukraine. Then the suggestion this week by some U.S. officials that the United States might offer Ukraine a Article 5-like security guarantee, referring to the NATO Article 5 of the NATO treaty as a part of this. So here's an unnamed senior U.S. official quoted in Politico. The basis of that agreement is basically to have really, really strong guarantees, Article 5-like. He went on to say, however, that those guarantees will not be on the table forever. They are on the table right now if there's a conclusion that is reached in a good way, unquote. Joe, if we're still talking about whether there will be territory, recognition of territory changing hands here, we're still talking about the nature of some kind of external security guarantee to Ukraine and what that would look like. Would the U.S. participate in it? I mean, those are the big questions that we've been talking about for months and I guess years now.
Look, I think that we all need to pause for a minute, take a deep breath, and recognize how insane this situation has become. I mean, if anything, Jillian, I think you were a little too generous or diplomatic about what's going on here. So we have a war that was started in February of 2022 when Russia decided to invade Ukraine. Ukraine did not do anything to provoke this invasion. Neither, frankly, did Western Europe. And so now we find ourselves in the situation where everyone is negotiating about how to end this war except for the party that started it. And so, I mean, I am just constantly struck by the sense of unreality about the situation where you have the Ukrainians negotiating with the Europeans and Americans about how to end a war that none of them started and none of them wanted, while the one party that actually did start the war and did want it and could end it yesterday refuses to participate in good faith in any of these discussions. So, I mean, when you get into then some of the finer points about issues like security guarantees or Ukrainian territorial concessions, I mean, I think that's all really interesting, and it is potentially an important part of any negotiated settlement if there's ever going to be one. But right now it just has a really strong whiff of everyone negotiating with themselves and not with the person who could actually change the situation on the ground, which is Vladimir Putin. I mean, some of this, such as the potential for U.S. or NATO security guarantee, is actually potentially fruitful, because that is one thing that Russia definitely does not want to see. And so I think if, perhaps if the Kremlin feels that that kind of condition is on the table as part of the peace negotiation, that encourages them to start negotiating in order to take that off the table again. But for a lot of the rest of it, I just find it really difficult to take this process seriously right now.
But the underlying threat, maybe implicit, is one way to put it, Gillian, is that the United States under President Trump might decide to wash its hands of this whole situation. And what is your sense from the Ukrainian sources that you talk to about how worried they are about that now, and whether they think that they have built up enough domestic defense capability that they can stand on their own if that were to come to pass?
I mean, it is concerning. Ukrainians have been looking at this for a long time, and they have invested a ton of manpower and resources and money into their own domestic weapons industry. And they're starting to develop some really helpful capabilities. You're starting to see drone warfare at the front line replacing artillery. You're starting to see Ukrainians developing long-range drones and missiles that are good substitutes for Western weaponry. And then you're also seeing Europe kind of trying to step up. But I was disturbed, last week to see a report from the Kiel Institute, which has been tracking support for Ukraine. And they were basically looking at this equation. So under the Trump administration, the U.S. has shifted from giving weapons to Ukraine to selling weapons for Ukraine. The idea was that Europe would step up. But this report found that between September and October, the Europeans only provided about $5 billion in new military aid. That's not enough to replace the United States. If you look at all of Ukraine's supporters around the world, so far up to October, about $39 billion in new aid. And that puts Ukraine on track for the lowest level of military support since the start of the war. Some of that can be offset by its domestic capacity that I was just talking about. But I think the key vulnerabilities for Ukraine are intelligence, which helps use those long-range Ukrainian weapons to target in Russia. And then also, Ukraine uses U.S. Patriot systems to take down Russian ballistic missiles. So those are kind of the two vulnerabilities. And I think that, unfortunately, the U.S. has shown that it's willing to use that as leverage to pressure Ukraine. Now, they are putting leverage and pressuring the wrong party. As Joe mentioned, the Ukrainians are coming to the negotiating table and wanting peace. Russia is the aggressor, and it's also the one that doesn't want peace. And the fatal flaw of these peace negotiations has been that the United States has been willing to put pressure on Kiev, but not put that same level of pressure on Moscow. And I don't see how you come up with a good negotiated settlement to this war until that equation changes.
That figure that Gillian cites about lagging European military aid to Ukraine does create kind of a disconnect, though, Joe, because simultaneously, there is some increasingly strong rhetoric being used by European leaders over the weekend. NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte suggested this: we must be prepared for the scale of war our grandparents or great-grandparents endured, unquote. Let's listen to a bit more of what he said.
We are Russia's next target. And we are already in harm's way. When I became NATO Secretary General last year, I warned that what is happening in Ukraine could happen to allied countries too. That we had to shift to a wartime mindset. This year we took the big decisions to make NATO stronger. At the summit in The Hague, allies agreed to invest 5% of GDP annually in defense by 2035. We agreed to increase defense production across the alliance. And we agreed to continue our support to Ukraine. But this is not the time for self-congratulation. I fear that too many are quietly complacent. Too many don't feel the urgency. And too many believe the time is on our side. It is not. The time for action is now.
Joe, I don't mean to minimize those moves, such as increasing the NATO defense spending target, but how do you read that kind of rhetoric coming out of European leaders? The NATO Secretary General saying, we are Russia's next target. If they're serious about that, it seems like, giving weapons to Russia's first target, people who are on the ground right now fighting on the front lines in Europe, would be a pretty obvious step.
So I mean, a couple points to make about that. One is that Mark Rutte, who we just heard from there, is not alone in making this kind of prediction. In fact, this has been part of a trend in recent weeks and even months of various European defense leaders across the continent coming out and issuing that kind of warning. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz over the weekend delivered a speech in which he warned that Russia's territorial ambitions are sort of like the Nazis after they annexed the Sudetenland in 1938. Russia won't stop. So I think that there is an awareness that there is a Russian threat, and I think it's important to understand that there has always been this awareness. I think that serious European leaders, and yes, there are a few, have understood for years that Putin had aspirations to challenge NATO, and in fact, he has been doing so in various ways, and that activity has only stepped up since the invasion of Ukraine. I think that they're grappling with a couple of problems. One is that they are very, very far behind in terms of the sort of military buildup that you would need in order to counter these threats effectively. So I think one of the reasons for all of the foot dragging in terms of delivering aid to Ukraine has been concern that they just don't have the defense production capacity to rebuild their stockpiles if they are sending all of these armaments to Ukraine. But I think that there's a bigger issue, which is actually the important context for some of these speeches that we're hearing now, which is just that it has become materially harder for Europe over the past 5 years or so to afford defense spending. They already had this problem where their budgets were squeezed by overgenerous social welfare states and very slow economic growth. And I think that the economic consequences of the pandemic have only exacerbated those problems. So I think that really what's going on now is that European leaders are starting to explain to their voters that there is a very serious security threat here that is going to require considerable effort, fiscally and also, frankly, by human beings, Europeans enlisting in militaries in order to counter it. And so I think that, understand that these speeches are part of that political effort that is aimed at explaining this threat to European voters who need to hear that message right now.
One imagines that it's easier to explain that threat the closer that voter base is to Ukraine and Russia. Jillian, notably Poland, being in the vanguard here in increasing its defense capabilities. And maybe that has something to do with the spillover effects of the Ukraine war. Your latest piece for the Journal is under the headline, How Russia's Ukraine War Crosses the Polish Border. You were reporting from a town in Poland that I won't even attempt to pronounce, 7 letters, 2 of them Z's. But tell us what you saw and what's going on there.
Yeah, so this town's called Rzeszów. And when you think about it, if you're a Gilmore Girls fan like I am, I want you to picture Stars Hollow. Like, this is a really wholesome little town in Eastern Europe. It's got this quaint, cute town square. Every fall, people come together and they have a bowl of soup that's as big as a hot tub. And they kind of brew it overnight over the top of a fire, and people line up with their bowls, and it's really cute and wholesome. But Rzeszów's about an hour-long drive from the Ukrainian border, and it's taken on all this geopolitical significance during the course of the war. And so you've got a major U.S. military presence in Rzeszów. You can see U.S. soldiers walking around. They're in plain clothes, but when they're walking around, they're smiling, which is very, very Eastern Europeans. They kind of stand out. And it's also become a transit hub for Ukrainian refugees who are coming out from Rzeszów and for foreign dignitaries who are coming in and weapons that are being sent to Ukraine. And so Russia has noticed this geopolitical significance of Rzeszów, and it started targeting it. And some of the stuff's really crazy. I mean, you fly into the airport. There's a great spot to get hot dogs at the airport, by the way. But it was actually the site of an attempted assassination on Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. I was talking to the mayor there, and he was telling me about how this has become a hotbed of Russian espionage. And that's something that's happening across Poland. I mean, just within about the last month, you saw in another small town an explosive on a railway site. And I think Poland got really lucky in that incident that, passengers weren't harmed. It could have been a lot worse. But all indications are that this was probably Russian sabotage. And this comes in the context of, in September, you had long-range Russian drones crossing over from Ukraine into Polish airspace. And so I think in Poland, there's certainly a heightened sensitivity about how this could spill over. But I want to zoom out a little bit into broader Europe, because this threat is unfortunately not limited to Europe's eastern flank anymore. And what you've seen is a series of suspicious drone sightings, several of them shutting down airports in Spain, disrupting flight. That's really, really far from Ukraine and Russia. Hovering over nuclear sites or military production facilities in Belgium. And I think if you're looking at the way that drone warfare has evolved throughout the course of this war, you saw Operation Spiderweb, where the Ukrainians took out strategic bombers deep within Russia. I think Western Europe is deluding itself if it thinks that this threat doesn't touch it, because it really could, and it's quite serious. So credit to these politicians for leveling with their public about the threats. But if Europe's going to take this threat seriously, like Joe said, it's got some tough choices ahead between its social welfare state and its defense spending.
And if leveling with the public is step one, Joe, the question then is, what is step two? I mean, you mentioned this level of social welfare spending. Some figures from a recent journal editorial on this subject. Government social spending as a share of GDP, 28% almost in Italy, 28% in Germany, 31% nearly in France, 23% in the UK, 26% in Spain. By the way, for comparison, 19.8% in the United States. So not all that far behind. And there is something difficult about the United States urging European countries to get serious about their pension problems and so forth, when in the United States, we are not getting particularly serious about our pension problems. I mean, remember, the Social Security plan is expected to be insolvent here in the early 2030s, maybe a one more presidential administration and a half away. And there is almost no serious talk about that by anybody who is in political power and could do the similar kind of job of a leveling with the voters here.
Well, I think a couple things are going to be in play there. One is related to actually backtracking a little and revisiting an observation that Jillian just made about how Western Europe is becoming much more aware of these problems, because this has been a major issue within the NATO alliance ever since the eastward expansion of the early 2000s, because I think that those Eastern formerly communist member states, especially countries like Poland or the Baltic countries, have always understood the Russian threat. There was sort of like this boy who cries wolf phenomenon, though, where the Western member states felt like these countries were exaggerating that Russian threat, tended not to take it seriously. Well, remember, the wolf shows up at the end of that story. And so I think that there is a growing awareness in Western Europe that the wolf is, in fact, there. So, I mean, as regards sort of how they're going to find the money to pay for this, the good news is the U.S. doesn't actually need to put pressure on them directly to do any of the social spending. All the U.S. has to do is put pressure on them to hit this 5% of GDP defense spending target, and the rest will end up taking care of itself. And an interesting dynamic that will develop there. A lot of countries have within them political constituencies for entitlement reform. They just have not been particularly emboldened by events lately. Well, I mean, now you have this demand for military spending. There's a reason to do entitlement reform. So we're having fitful debates about that in the United Kingdom, which is where Jillian and I live. I think that there's an emerging debate about pension reform, the equivalent of America's Social Security for the elderly, brewing in Germany. I think that there's an ongoing budget emergency in France that is going to have to work itself out in some form, and part of the context for that will be demands for more military spending. So, this is an instance where the U.S. doesn't necessarily have to come into it with any cleaner hands than anyone else. But we do, first off, have to be prepared to increase our own defense spending, which is something that the Trump administration hasn't always been prepared to do. And then we just need to apply pressure to our allies to live up to their defense commitments and then leave it to them to figure out how best to do that.
Jillian, what's your view on that? Do you share that optimism, if I can characterize it that way? I mean, both of you guys have forgotten more about the French pension system than I ever knew. But as far as I can tell, as somebody who is looking across the pond at all of this, I mean, it's heartening to see the rhetoric from the NATO Secretary General and some other political leaders, but I still find myself wondering, given the war that is currently going on in Eastern Europe, the imminent threat that those leaders are talking about, or they say that they see, how long that might take to really sink in through the politics to the electorates and the voter bases of Europe.
Sure. I think it's happening in fits and starts. And if you would have asked me last week, I would have been in a pretty bad mood about this question because France had just rolled back its pension reform. So a step in the wrong direction with an aging population and a growing social and retirement burden. That said, I do think that Donald Trump has European attention. I mean, the reaction here to his national security strategy just berating Europe. I've heard more conversations where people are going, wow, this threat does look serious. And we are a little bit worried that if Russia decides to do something dramatic, we might be left on our own. So I think those two things are in tension. And Joe talked a little bit about Europe figuring this out. I think that political dynamic is certainly playing out. But I am encouraged by the rhetoric of these political leaders because I think for a while they've been telling their public, don't worry about this. We've got it under control. But if you look at the ways that Russia has been escalating, the situation's not under control. And I think it's time to level with the European public about this, because what it's really pitting is maybe grandpa's retirement versus your grandson's future and his life if he's going to have to go fight. And I'm happy to see more leaders framing it that way.
Thank you, Jillian and Joe. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button. And we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.